First of all, I must say that I was rather surprised to be invited, because given what the press and the media and some of the people camping out at St. Paul's and Wall Street think about banks and bankers, I think it took a lot of courage to ask me to show up today. For me also, it's been quite exciting because I've listened very carefully to previous presentations. I must congratulate the organizers for an excellent show. I mean, some of the speakers have been, many of the speakers have been absolutely brilliant, pretty much all of them, from sex to art to technology. I've enjoyed every single one of them. You know, we talk about Africa, and some of us know Africa from afar, some of us live in Africa, some of us work in Africa. And I think, as Hadil said, Africa is maybe 54, 55 countries, give or take one or two small islands. Most of those countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. Many of them are landlocked, many of them are very small. Togo, which is the country where I live in, 5 million people, $6 billion GDP. It's clear to us that over the last 50 years or so, since we had political independence, Africa seems to have drifted away to the rest of the world, and it's only recently trying to catch up. I'll not bore you with the statistics. Most of you know more about it than I do. But in 1960, Ghana was way ahead of South Korea. Today, the situation is significantly reversed. In fact, Ghana, which is the poster child of Africa, is a hippie country. That is a highly indebted, poor country. But that is all history now. The question for me, and the question I want to share with you today, is what should we be doing going forward? For those of you who are old enough, and I think this crowd bridges quite a wide age group, we grew up in the era of World Bank economists and advisors coming through to Africa and talking about import substitution and the lack of investment capital in Africa. So a lot of African governments invested in state-owned companies and the rest of them. In the late 70s and 80s, we moved on to what was called structural adjustment programs, which significantly impoverished a lot of people, including my dad, who was a retired civil servant, lived on a very good pension, and found that his pension more than halved within a very short period of time. But the advantage of that was that it put Africa in a very strong position. There was significant institutional reforms, fiscal prudence, and now we have the reverse. Africa is doing very well, and what do we have? Highly indebted developed countries. Greece, Ireland, Spain, Portugal. The program for them, I think, is slightly different from the one that was prescribed for Ghana and the rest of them. But we've moved on from that. And now, over the last few years, we've had Africa looking east. So we have the Africa-China Summit. And we all headed off to Shanghai. All the heads of states, all the ministers. And then we had the Africa-India Summit. And we all headed off to India. And what is interesting about all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is that we seem to be looking for salvation from outside of Africa. Now, the reality of it is, the empirical evidence is that no foreigners ever developed a country. The nationals develop their own countries, and the foreigners help. So I ask the question, why have we not had an Africa-Africa summit? The room goes silent. This leads me on to the second point which I want to share with you today, which is Africa cannot develop without integration, without having a larger market, without breaking down the barriers. We must create bigger markets. Togo, where I live, 5 million people, 6 billion GDP, is going nowhere without being part of a larger market. And you go back to history and you ask yourself some very blunt questions. Why can we not, for example, allow for the free movement of people across Africa? It's happening currently. In West Africa, across the 14 countries of the ECOWAS, there's free movement of people. And that's been on for over 20 years. And it worked. So it has been done. So why haven't the rest of Africa done it? Why can we not remove barriers to the free movement of capital? Anybody here from Francophone West Africa? Francophone Central Africa? They've been doing it for over 50 years. So it's being done in Africa as we speak. Now, why can we not have rail and air transportation that's integrated? Some of you probably not old enough. They used to have what they call the West African Airways Corporation, and it covered a number of countries, and it worked. And we had Air Afrique, and it worked for some time, and then it stopped working. The fact is, when African nations became independent, they not only became independent from their colonial masters, they became independent from themselves. So every single African country set up its own central bank, its own airline with one plane. And I'm not kidding, it exists today. And in fact, it's even worse than that. There are 3 countries sharing one plane, so that's sort of like, you change the first target, you go along. I know because I fly it from time to time. I've got to be very careful here because I have to go back to Africa for this. Okay. But I think the point is, the reason why we have not done so is because we have chosen not to. The question is, why have we chosen not? If you have the political will, you can, as from tomorrow, bring down all the barriers to the movement of people in Africa. It doesn't require an act of parliament. It's purely an administrative process. You can make African currencies fully convertible. It doesn't require an act of parliament. It's a purely administrative process. You can try to work together to pool your resources. It doesn't require an act of parliament. It requires a volition to want to do that. So why have African governments, why have African nations not done that? The answer is probably politically incorrect, so I will not go down that path. But if I'm invited again, I might do that because I may be retired by then, so I don't have to worry. But let me talk a little bit about what we have tried to do under the circumstances. EcoBank, for the information of everyone here, is not a Nigerian bank, contrary to what the Nigerians say. EcoBank is a Pan-African bank. We're headquartered in Togo. Now, Togo is that little country between Ghana and Benin, for those of you who don't know. It used to be 3 times the size it is today. The Ghanaians took 1/3, the Beninese took 1/3, and what we have today is 1/3, which is what is left. So it's only about 50, 60 miles across. As I've said, it's 5 million people, $6 billion GDP. We created a bank there in 1985, and the bank was created by African businesses and African businessmen who at that time encountered significant problems in dealing with banks in West Africa because those banks were either state-owned or foreign-owned. So they said, why don't we create our own bank? And they did. And that bank is headquartered in Togo. And over the last 25 years or so, the bank has grown to 32 countries in Africa. We have the largest network of banks across all of Africa. And we have 3 offices abroad in Dubai, in Paris, and in London. Now, most of you would say, why haven't we heard about EcoBank? Why isn't EcoBank making so much noise if they have a larger presence? Because the next bank to us is present in only 17 African countries. The reason is that if you're working, you don't have much time to talk. Okay? So what we try to do is the following. We said to ourselves that if the government were not going to do it, we're going to try and do it ourselves in the private sector. And we started that process. It's been extremely difficult, but believe me, it's been a lot of fun. If you have a sense of adventure, if you have a sense of humor, and you can wait for 4 hours to see a minister, fantastic. But the reason why we have been able to do it, more than anything else, is the reason why I say perception is different from reality. The reality of Africa is that it's not as risky as it's made out to be. The perception of Africa is of a very risky continent. We say that with some sense because we love difficult countries. We run the biggest bank in Chad. We run the biggest bank in Central African Republic. We run the biggest bank in Liberia. And we've done that based on a simple principle. Countries cannot be at war perpetually. Eventually they'll settle down because eventually people will have to step back. They have families, they have kids, they have a future to look forward to. We also believed in Africa. So we said to ourselves, we don't have an African strategy. We never had an African strategy. Africa is our strategy. So we will stay in a country, and the only way you'll get us out of any single country in Africa is to kick us out. And then if you kick us out, we'll be back at the door waiting to be let in. We have a board of directors that's made up of 9 nationalities. We run a bank that's made up of 23 people from 38 African nationalities across 1,120 or 30 branches. So the message I bring is a message of hope, a message of turning talk into action, a message of saying, why not? Why can't we do it? The only reason, ladies and gentlemen, we can't do it is because we don't want to do it. I have been attending conferences, and with all due respect, this is a different conference. The variety here is quite different. I'm not used to this. I mean, you can draw energy from this crowd, which is not what typically is boring bankers, each one of them trying to sound off. Here you have, I was actually learning a lot and mixing with people who I was sort of like picking a lot of good energy from. But most of the conferences I attended over the last 20 have been on Africa. Africa Rising, Africa the new destination, Africa this. And right from the mid-'80s till now, that's exactly what it's been. Same theme, different topics, every time you change the topic. And I spoke at one of the conferences. I said, gentlemen, I really don't have much to say, but when are we going to act? Okay? You talk about privatization. Africa is still privatizing. Russia and Eastern Europe have finished. They finished 20 years ago. We take a lot of time to do things, and we congratulate ourselves for doing those things sometimes. The reality is that we do have the capacity, we do have the people, we do have the capital. I am not persuaded that Africa doesn't have the capital to develop. The country that invests the most in Africa right now, outside of the oil sector, is an African country, South Africa. One of the biggest investors in Africa today is a Nigerian businessman called Aliko Dangote. He has committed to invest $3 billion in Africa. And I remember when I spoke to him once, and I said to him, Mr. Dangote, what is your competitive advantage? Why do you think you can succeed? You know what he said? He said, you tell me which board of directors, anywhere outside of Africa, will vote $3 billion for investing in Africa. They'll probably fire the whole board. They'd say they're crazy. But he has built the 6th or 7th largest cement company in the world on the back of that philosophy. He also happens to be the richest man on the Forbes list. So maybe I'm in the wrong business. I should be in the cement business. So what I'd like to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to conclude on a positive note. The future for Africa is bright. The future for Africa is in the hands of Africans. Don't kid yourself. It can be done. It has been done. MTN has built the 8th largest telecoms company out of Africa. Out of 4 Africa. So, let us continue with the TEDx approach. Let's not just talk about boring finance, boring future of Africa. Let's talk about the exciting things, the art, the culture, the literature, the future. Because for me, and I hope for every one of you, the future is Africa. Thank you all very much.